year was 1774. Across the vast Atlantic Ocean, the British Empire stretched from the coasts of India to the forests of North America. It was an empire of trade, of power, and of order. At its heart stood the Crown and Parliament, confident in their authority. Yet, in the American colonies, whispers of rebellion were growing louder. For over a decade, tensions had simmered. Laws passed in London had been resisted in Boston. Taxes imposed in Parliament had been burned in Philadelphia. Soldiers sent to enforce order were jeered in the streets of New York. And when Parliament struck hardest, when it closed Boston's harbor, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and quartered troops among its citizens, it did not break the spirit of the colonists. Instead, it set the colonies ablaze with anger. The American people were no longer content to simply protest. They were preparing for something greater, something more dangerous, something revolutionary. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. They came not as rebels, but as representatives. Lawyers, planters, merchants, and ministers. They came to find a way to restore peace, but also to defend their liberties. The meeting took place at Carpenter's Hall. 56 men filled the room. Among them were names that history would never forget: George Washington, tall, reserved, a soldier of Virginia; Patrick Henry, fiery and passionate, whose words could set a room aflame; John Adams, the sharp legal mind from Massachusetts; Samuel Adams, his cousin, already whispered about as a dangerous radical; and John Jay, the calm statesman from New York. The hall buzzed with uncertainty. What was this Congress to do? Were they there to petition the king? Or were they there to defy him? The debates were fierce. Some, like Joseph Galloway, proposed a plan for a colonial parliament within the empire. A compromise, a bridge back to Britain. Others, like Patrick Henry, argued that the time for compromise had passed. "I am not a Virginian," he thundered, "but an American." It was a declaration of unity. A recognition that their struggle was no longer the plight of one colony, but of all. For weeks, the delegates argued. They debated boycotts, petitions, and even the possibility of war. Outside, the streets of Philadelphia buzzed with rumors. Merchants, farmers, and sailors all waited to hear whether their leaders would submit or resist. Then came news from Massachusetts. Resolutions passed by the towns of Suffolk County, just outside Boston. The Suffolk Resolves were unlike anything the colonies had seen before. They rejected the intolerable acts outright. They declared them null and void. They called upon the people to arm themselves, to raise militias, to refuse obedience to royal authority. The message was clear: Massachusetts would not submit. The Congress debated whether to endorse such radical defiance. To do so was to step closer to open rebellion. Yet, to refuse was to abandon Massachusetts in its hour of need. In the end, the delegates stood together. They endorsed the resolves unanimously. It was more than an act of solidarity. It was a turning point. The colonies had publicly supported resistance. They had accepted that force might be met with force. Still, not all sought war. Many delegates clung to the hope of reconciliation. They believed that if they appealed to the king directly, he would intervene, overturn Parliament's harsh laws, and restore harmony. Thus, on October 14, 1774, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. The document affirmed the colonies' loyalty to the Crown. But it also insisted that the colonists were entitled to the same rights as Englishmen, the right to govern their own affairs, the right to trial by jury, the right not to be taxed without representation. It declared Parliament's authority over the colonies illegitimate in matters of internal governance. To enforce their demands, the Congress also established the Continental Association. A boycott of British imports and exports. Merchants would no longer buy British goods. Farmers would no longer ship their crops across the ocean. The colonies would strike at Britain's wealth. It was economic warfare. When the Congress adjourned on October 26, its delegates promised to meet again the following year if Britain refused to relent. And so they returned to their homes, uncertain of what lay ahead. While Congress debated, the people of Massachusetts acted. Governor Thomas Gage, Britain's commander in Boston, struggled to assert control. Parliament had given him power, but the people gave him nothing. In the countryside, militias drilled in town commons. Blacksmiths hammered out muskets and bayonets. Powder and shot were hidden in barns and cellars. Crowds of farmers shut down courts loyal to the king. Sheriffs resigned rather than enforce royal decrees. Committees of safety, elected by the people, took their place. Massachusetts had become, in all but name, an independent colony. The royal governor controlled Boston, but beyond the city, the countryside was in rebellion. In early 1775, General Gage received orders. He was to seize the rebel leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and to capture colonial supplies stored at Concord, a small town 20 miles outside Boston. On the night of April 18, 1775, 700 British soldiers set out from Boston. Their red coats glimmered under the moonlight, their muskets gleaming. But the colonists were ready. Riders had been dispatched. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott. Through the dark countryside, they galloped, warning the villages, the regulars are coming out. Bells rang. Drums beat. Militiamen grabbed their muskets and assembled. At dawn, the British reached Lexington Green, where 70 colonial militias stood waiting. The air was tense, charged with silence. Then, somewhere, a shot rang out. No one knew who fired it. The British soldiers unleashed a volley. 8 colonists lay dead. The redcoats pressed on to Concord. There, at the North Bridge, they found hundreds of militiamen blocking their way. The two sides exchanged fire. The British faltered. They turned back. But the retreat was chaos. From behind stone walls, fences, and trees, colonial militiamen poured fire into their ranks. By the time the redcoats staggered back to Boston, nearly 300 of their number were dead or wounded. The battles of Lexington and Concord had lit the fuse. The war had begun. When news of the fighting reached Philadelphia, the colonies moved swiftly. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened. The delegates returned, but now the mood was transformed. They were no longer debating grievances. They were organizing for war. The Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. His tall frame, military bearing, and reputation for honor made him the natural choice. They authorized the printing of paper money to fund supplies. They sent envoys to seek allies abroad. Still, they clung to a final hope for peace. In July, they issued the Olive Branch Petition, begging King George III to intervene, to halt the bloodshed, to restore their rights. But the king refused even to read it. Instead, he declared the colonies in open rebellion. There would be no reconciliation. The months that followed were a storm. Militia surrounded Boston, trapping British soldiers inside the city. In June 1775, the colonists fought fiercely at Bunker Hill, proving that they could stand against trained British troops. Across the colonies, men pledged themselves to the cause. Farmers left their plows, blacksmiths their forges, lawyers their courts. All to take up arms. Pamphlets spread revolutionary ideas. Newspapers thundered with calls for liberty. Ordinary colonists began to see themselves not as British subjects, but as Americans. The road that began with words. The Suffolk Resolves, the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, the protests of the First Congress, had now ended in war. The First Continental Congress had sought reconciliation. The Suffolk Resolves had called for defiance. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances had asserted colonial liberties. But in the streets of Massachusetts, those words became action. At Lexington and Concord, muskets spoke louder than parchment. And when the Second Continental Congress met, it did not ask what rights the colonies should have. It asked how they would win them. The war for independence had begun. The 13 colonies, once scattered, loyal outposts of the British Empire, were now on the path to becoming a nation. History remembers battles and heroes, treaties and kings. But revolutions are not born in a single moment. They are prepared in secret meetings, in debates held in candlelit halls, in papers drafted with trembling hands. The American Revolution was not just a war. It was an idea. Nurtured in words, forged in defiance, and sealed in blood. From Philadelphia's Congress to Lexington's Green, the people of America had made their choice. They would not be subjects. They would be free.